All right. Hello, everyone. The title of my thesis is A Gateway to Self, the concept of the mind in yoga, therapy, and philosophy. As someone who was attracted to yoga for its inner benefits, the question arose for me, why does it seem that conversations about yoga always seem to start with postures? So the purpose of the research was twofold: to explore the mind's role in yoga in a world in which the body is centered. And the second reason was to explore how the mind allows us to connect to the self, the yogic concept of the self. And I'll try to connect these ideas to contemporary issues in yoga as well. But please note that as I am talking about the mind and centering the mind, I'm not decentering the body. The body is just as important, and body and mind are inextricably linked. I like to think about the mind, the body, and the self as characters in the book of yoga. And the mind becomes a central character at times, and the body becomes a central character at times. And the self is a recurring character as well, but it almost seems that it's been written out of the script lately. When I speak of the self, I'm talking about a yoga philosophy term that's transcendent in nature, hard to define. But in one definition of yoga, Stuart Sarbacker speaks to the mental and physical changes that occur through practice. There's mention of heightened capacities, and that speaks to this change that happens from the normal and the everyday, but there's no specific mention of a yogic self. The yogic self is not the same as the everyday self that we speak about in conversation. It's transcendent, and there's a timeless aspect. But it's missing from this definition too in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And the dictionary definition doesn't tell us at all about what's required to realize that yogic self. And I'll tell you more about the definitions shortly after this. But first, in terms of the yogic self, I'll cover two types. The first is called Purusha. It's a unique self of pure consciousness and discernment. And in yoga philosophy and its related philosophy, Samkhya, Purusha is conjoined with material reality we call Prakriti. The goal of liberation is for Purusha to isolate from Prakriti and become independent. So the liberation for this self is actually with the help of Prakriti. In the second type of the self, we have the Atman and the Brahman, the individual self, and the very large, all-encompassing universal self. And for this type of self, the liberation is one of union. So the definitions in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the popular dictionary that we all know, doesn't look like this anymore. The first two definitions are mutable personality characteristics. They may change from typical to temporary states. And the third one is about an optimum state, our best self. And these are all mutable, right? So we're not really talking about the yogic self, which is immutable. A fourth definition speaks to the Pancha Maya Kosha model a little bit, the union of elements of body, emotions, thoughts, and sensations. But here again, there's a difference. There's no transcendent component, such as the Ananda Maya Kosha in the Panchamaya Kosha model. A fifth definition is the realization or embodiment of an abstraction. This may be the closest we have to yoga's definition. There's an elusiveness to the self. In the Katha Upanishad, an inquisitive boy named Nachiketa asked Yama, the god of death, God personified, about the self. Describing the self, Yama states, this self cannot be grasped by teachings or by intelligence, or even by great learning. Only the man who chooses can grasp him, whose body the self chooses as his own. Not a man who has not quit his evil ways nor a man who is not calm or composed, nor even a man who is without a tranquil mind could ever secure it by his mere wit. Here, Yama makes clear that the self is not easy to understand. It's not reached by teachings or intelligence. It's experiential in nature, and there are prerequisites of ethical living, calmness, composure, and a tranquil mind. Seth Powell, in his dissertation, makes the distinction between yoga as isolation and yoga of union. We can use metaphors to understand yoga intellectually, creating a bridge between concept and lived experience. Like the pie on the right of the slide, each piece can be merged together into a whole, or each piece can be taken apart and exist by itself. Metaphors aren't always perfect, but it helps to get the basic idea. So how do we get to this place of liberation? We first try to work with the mind and get to a state of absorption in the mind. The chariot model of the mind explains a system, actually, that includes mind, intellect, the senses, and even the self. The mind can be pulled strongly by the senses, just like horses, perhaps so strongly it pulls the chariot out off the road and into a ditch. The charioteer, the intellect, is able to direct the reins, i.e. the mind, towards concentration. And the self is along for the ride, like an observer. In this model, according to the Gita, desire arises from manas as well. So we have two challenges, being pulled by the senses or desire from the mind itself. Fixing the mind in meditation using the intellect enables one to bring that system into an optimal place, and it makes understanding of the self possible. We have another obstacle to the self. These are deep-seated patterns that drive the fluctuations of the minds, the vritis. The root of all of our suffering is the first klesha, ignorance of the knowledge of the self. We're able to root out kleshas through long-term yogic practice. For example, Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali, the 8 limbs. And stilling the changing states of the mind is Patanjali's definition of yoga that shows how central the mind is to the practice. He begins his classic work, the Yoga Sutra, with this in Yoga Sutra 1.2. He then goes on to tell us about fixing the mind on support or an object to eliminate disturbances in the mind, doubt, carelessness, sloth, and others. And there are other ways to fix the mind. For example, Yoga Sutra 1.33, the Brahma Vihara, the cultivation of 4 attitudes, the friendliness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These may be familiar to you if you do Buddhist or mindfulness meditation. And he also speaks in 1.36 of the steadiness of the mind and how it should be pain-free and luminous, qualities that we should instill in us. Absorption. In Patanjali's yoga, the culmination is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind, allowing for a state of absorption, samadhi. And another type of yoga that comes later, 11th to the 18th century, Hatha yoga, has become synonymous with postures and energy manipulation, chakras. But there's also a mind aspect to this as well. So the culmination of that practice is Raja Yoga, and it was centered on the no mind state. So yogic absorption is common in these different types of yoga, and they lead to different notions of liberation of the self. And the Shiva Samhita, Hatha Yoga text, presents the highest of the highest yogas, presented by Shiva himself. It comes with the prerequisite of acquiring knowledge, so philosophy is important to some extent. In this case, the philosophy of Vedanta, that union. There's a caution to not let knowledge for its sake alone to distract you from the experience of the self. So not to overthink it, and to enjoy the practice and experience. Eventually, in this practice, one has a non-dual understanding or perspective. The difference between I and that goes away. So it's a yoga as union perspective. There's an inner illumination and a unique knowledge develops. More recently, the yoga therapy master, TKV Desikachar, wrote about how the mind is a gateway to the self. He writes, Manas is translated as the mind's structure, but is very close to the sense. Chitta is the same mind, but it's closer to consciousness or the self. If I'm very agitated or disturbed, chitta becomes manas. Or when I'm a little more attentive, manas becomes chitta. So the quality of the mind shifts. And we come to the present moment in which we have the popular concept of self-care. A variety of activities can be considered self-care. I'll take, for example, watching a Netflix streaming series. So in one series, the story may cause us to reflect on our actions, words, and thoughts, and it can lead us to a greater connection to the self. On the contrary, another series may cause us to feel a lot of pleasure and to want to keep watching and watching and watching. We have raga, or attachment, or even further and further away from the self, and we have avidya, ignorance. But keep in mind that this self-care is of the prakritic nature, right? It's the body, mind, and our material needs. But this is all important too, as well. We shouldn't discount that. But the concept of a transcendent self feeds our long-term and short-term goals. Self is enduring and pure discrimination. With stronger discrimination, we make better choices, repeatedly coming back to the self as a source that feeds us. In the process, in the cyclical process, we build a narrative of our own, of the self. And today's yoga is largely focused on postural yoga, but we may be better served in the long run by prioritizing the self. To study the self, set aside time for inner reflection, perhaps spending less time watching Netflix. One may invest in a long-term meditation program and devote practice to the other 7 limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga system. Devote time to the contemplation of texts, the arts, and study with teachers who know and understand this concept. To set the right conditions, it may mean changing your practice and your lifestyle. For posture-focused teachers, it may mean a small step, like instilling or taking time to be in a pose slightly longer, instilling concentration, and giving that one moment of stillness, and giving full attention to Shavasana, and maybe taking up forms of practice that are a little slower in nature. So finally, when one has been able to have these experiences for oneself, yoga teachers and therapists may be able to advocate for this for their clients. So as a yoga therapist, perhaps give the client a long-term goal of spending time with the self. And this can give them a wider context for why they're practicing and a reason to keep coming back to their practice. And in this way, the client may then begin to collect their own stories of the self, ones which continue to be a constant source of inspiration for them. Thank you.